So I read Frankenstein because it's a classic, and I'm trying to read all of the classics. I've read Animal Farm, Gatsby, To Kill a Mockingbird, Frankenstein, obviously, and right now I'm reading The Picture of Dorian Gray. So I've heard a lot about Victor's famous hubris and his subsequent selfishness. I've heard that Mary Shelley was only 17 when she wrote it, which, to be honest, I am a little bit sick of hearing. For some background on Shelley, she was born in 1987 Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin to her mother, also named Mary Wollstonecraft. She's a writer, philosopher, and advocate for women's rights, and father, prominent English philosopher William Godwin. Her mother died just 11 days after she was born. Godwin would go on to marry yet another woman named Mary Claremont, which marks 3 Marys for this video so far, which is only 3 less than the Bible. She met her future husband, Percy Shelley, in 1812 at age 15, and then she eloped with him in 1814 when she was only 17. He then will go on to die in 1822 when she was 25, and Frankenstein was published in 1818 when she was 21. She actually began writing Frankenstein after a meeting with Lord Byron in Switzerland, during which he had suggested they all do an exercise in writing and write horror novels. I think that Frankenstein is a snub at William Godwin's philosophical career and beliefs, William Godwin being Mary Shelley's father. He believed in the potential for the limitless progress of man. Enter Victor Frankenstein, a cautionary tale for what happens when man progresses too far in the pursuit of knowledge. To explain how Godwin is like Victor, first you have to know about Godwin. So Godwin was a founder of philosophical anarchism and argued passionately for education and the acquisition of knowledge. In his book, one of his many books, An Enquiry Concerning Political Justice, written in 1793, he argued that the government is a corrupting force in society, perpetuating dependence and ignorance, but that it will be rendered increasingly unnecessary and powerless by the gradual spread of knowledge and the expansion of human understanding. This book was written in the early years of the French Revolution before the Terror began, or more commonly called the Reign of Terror, which was a period from September 5th, 1793 to July 27th, 1794, during which at least 300,000 suspects were arrested, 17,000 were officially executed, and maybe 10,000 died in prison with no trial. If you're interested in the French Revolution, as I always assume that most people are, I have linked Oversimplified's videos on the subject below. They are an entertaining source of information, excellent to fall asleep to, especially the sections on execution by guillotine. Also, the full title of Godwin's book was actually An Enquiry Concerning Political Justice and its influence on general virtue and happiness. A short tangent, I was reading An Enquiry Concerning Political Justice, and I noticed that in the first paragraph, there's a lot of S's that looked like they are swapped for F's. I'll put a photo up here. I did think for a minute there while I was reading it that Godwin was just a freak, but then I brought it up to a friend of mine who thought it sounded familiar. So, what I've learned is that it's actually a feature of writing from the 8th to 19th century. And it's called the long S. Turns out that the S we're used to today is actually referred to as the short or round S, and it's more modern. Fun linguistic fact. So I want to dive into Godwin's views and the contents of his famous paper, but before I do that, I'm going to briefly explain anarchism as a concept, so everyone buckle up. The term anarchism is derived from the negation of the Greek term arche, hopefully I pronounced that right, which means first, principal, foundation, or ruling power. So anarchy is thus rule by no one, or non-rule. Some would argue that non-ruling is equal to unanimous group rule, like mob mentality or mob rule would be a form of non-rule that some may say is anarchistic in nature. Political anarchism is focused on centralized power, seeing it as illegitimate. Anarchism is sort of distinguished into political and philosophical, though it branches out into other areas that I'm not going to get into, like religion and literature. Philosophical anarchism is much more theoretical and less of a type of activism. The idea of anarchism is sort of used to cast skepticism towards foundationalism, and that position is referred to as anti-foundationalism, which is the view of one who believes that there are no fundamental beliefs that ground basic inquiry or knowledge. An easy example of a fundamental belief would be a belief in God. Such a belief acts as the foundation to build knowledge upon. So somebody who subscribes to anti-foundationalism would not believe in such a fundamental belief, such as God, but not as they don't believe in God, but as the fundamental belief in God as a concept to build knowledge upon. So political anarchism is focused against attempts to justify political power, and it's more of a movement. But both basically say that there's no one person or idea that should have so much power or importance attributed to it, be that government with literal power or foundational belief. I believe the idea of a ruling class is also itself potentially a foundational belief. Overall, anarchism is skeptical of consolidated power, state or person. I'm going to go through a few of my thoughts about Godwin. He was concerned with government, state, and the idea of freedom of will and thought. He does not consider truth to be a transcendental idea, and to my best understanding, this means he does not agree with the concept of truth as a non-physical idea. This is very reminiscent of the anti-foundational nature of philosophical anarchism. He casts doubt on the possibility for things to be true. True things are always subject to be disproven by new information or adjusted. The idea of truth is a big concept in epistemology, the study of knowledge, because one of the biggest questions in epistemology is what it means to know something. It discusses that knowledge is not equal to static text, and in order for knowledge to exist, it requires a mind to know it. Epistemology would also be concerned with the question of what it means to know something is true, and whether or not the truth of something can actually be transmitted from one person to another. Godwin advocated that a healthy dose of skepticism should be applied to all ideas, essentially saying that you should do your own thinking and evaluation of ideas. He wanted everyone to be an independent thinker, applying their own judgments to anything they learned. He placed a great deal of importance on intellectual power and education for all, specifically a diverse education that includes conversation with a diverse number of minds and exposure to all kinds of ideas. Given his penchant for anarchism, he thought a direct democracy would be best, where a group of people were able to govern themselves. I think this point here is one of the major fallacies of anarchism. Humanity usually sorts themselves into a hierarchy. No matter how much you preach about the ideals of self-governance, the same pattern seems to emerge every time. Humanity is unproductive without leadership. A leader always emerges. Even in a commune where everyone is taken to be more or less equal, leaders emerge. I personally think this is based on a need for organization. Organization is a kind of discipline that requires an active participant. It's reflected in nature, things like the food chain or pack behavior, where there's an obvious leader who organizes. From my own conclusions, and without doing much research into the subject, I think that another factor is the natural selection of decisiveness as a trait. To be decisive is advantageous. The ability to make a strong decision can be the difference between life and death, and deciding is a skill, evident through the existence of decision fatigue, which is the mental exhaustion of back-to-back decision-making. All in all, I think the idea of self-governance is morally or ethically appealing because people think that it allows for freedom and independence. People tend to idealize freedom conceptually because they think to be free is good because no one wants to have their will denied. Realistically, these things are only considerations of a society that already has all of their survival needs met and now has the luxury to consider what they want morally or ethically and what is comfortable. Free will is a notion of sort of a childish society, and furthermore, I think that those advocating for free will often confuse the various notions that make it up. Freedom of thought, freedom from consequence, freedom of action, freedom of speech. Like, which one of these things do we actually want to have, and are we willing to admit that they are all branches of free will? Anyway, Godwin, while being for education, is not for an educational system because, simply put, he doesn't trust the government to educate in a way that is not self-advantageous. Godwin apparently thought we would come to a point where the dominance of mind over matter would be so complete that mental perfectibility would take physical form, allowing us to control illness and aging and become immortal. He refers to this idea as earthly immortality, and he discusses it briefly in the first edition of Political Justice. This ties into his ideas of human education and knowledge and sort of ramps it up to the next level. I would almost refer to this as an idolization of knowledge. The chapter he begins to express these ideas in is chapter 6, entitled Human Inventions Capable of Perpetual Improvement, and then to follow the headings for the ideas in this chapter: perfectibility of man, instanced first in language, its beginnings, abstraction, complexity of language, second instance, alphabetical writing, hieroglyphs at first, universal, progressive deviations, application. This is on page 43. If any of you are crazy enough to be reading along, I have the PDF linked down below. He begins by saying this, quote, "If we would form ourselves to a solid estimate of political or indeed of any other science, we ought not to confine our survey to that narrow portion of things which passes under our own immediate inspection, and rashly pronounce everything that we have not ourselves seen to be impossible." Here he sets a precedent for the ideas he's about to put forth, and he seems aware of the fact that what he's about to propose seems insane. He begins by speaking at length about how far we have progressed already as a species, particularly in language, saying, quote, "The distance is immeasurable between the 3 or 4 vague and inarticulate sounds uttered by animals and the copiousness of lexicography or regularity of grammar," end quote. He says that language is something so complex that the progression we've experienced of it from such a rudimentary state would seem impossible had it not obviously been done. He describes the invention of the modern alphabet as another seemingly impossible feat, to condense the sounds of all words into 24 simple letters. He draws this comparison to man in his initial state and pulls him through all of his intellectual accomplishments thus far: philosophy, arts, science, and then he makes his main point, that man must be capable of still further progress. Quote, "There is no science that is not capable of additions. There is no art that may not be carried to still a higher perfection. If this be true of all other sciences, why not of morals?" End quote. He speaks of man elevating beyond current progress, setting the groundwork for the idea that man could progress even to the point of immortality, something that seemed impossible at the time, as the creation of the alphabet once seemed impossible in the same way. It's worth noting that other scholars of the time dismissed this idea as insane, and Godwin himself never really brought it up again in his later works. He was apparently influenced in this idea of infinite progress by French philosopher, now please excuse me while I butcher this man's name, but I've written it out phonetically, so bear with me here. His full name was apparently Marie-Jean-Antoine-Nicolas de Caritat, and his title was the Marquis du Condorcet. I will link the video down below that I used to try and pronounce his name so that you can hear someone French actually pronounce it correctly. But anyway, he agrees with the idea of endless progress and that the human mind can apparently assign no fixed limits to its own advancement in knowledge and virtue, or even to the potential prolongation of life. Here's where we're going to pivot to Victor Frankenstein. Frankenstein explores the consequence of the progress of man. Victor Frankenstein begins as this young, inquisitive kid growing up in the French countryside. He is first taken with philosophy and the readings of some early intellectuals, Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, Albertus Magnus, and Paracelsus, 2 Germans, and 1 Swiss. I won't say who's which. When he's 17, he leaves to attend a university in Germany, where he discovers a love of science and begins down the path that would lead him to create his monster. By the time he is building the monster, Victor is drunk on the idea of progress. He's obsessed with pursuing the secrets of life and death, quickly learning how to create life. He describes his discovery as all-consuming. Quote, "But this discovery was so great and overwhelming that all the steps by which I had been progressively led to it were obliterated, and I beheld only the result. What had been the study and desire of the wisest men since the creation of the world was now within my grasp. Not that, like a magic scene, it all opened upon me at once. The information I had obtained was of a nature rather to direct my endeavors so soon as I should point them towards the object of my search than to exhibit that object already accomplished. I was like the Arabian who had been buried with the dead and found a passage to life, aided only by one glimmering and seemingly ineffectual light." End quote. He never doubts that he will create a new life, and he works himself to the point of emaciation, dedicating every part of himself to the task of creating a man. Only when his abomination wakes up does it dawn on him the gravity of what he has done. He instantly flees the room and passes out in an adjacent room, and when he sees his monster upon waking up, he flees again, abandoning his creation without a second thought. The consequence of his quest for progress is the lives of each of his loved ones, beginning with his little brother, whom the monster kills. Next, a young woman who serves at his house, who is framed by the monster for the murder of that little brother. Victor discovers that the consequence is not only his, but that his monster suffers as well. He is utterly lonely in this world, with no hope for companionship because he is the only creature of his kind. He's tormented by this loneliness. He observes the happy families of others, and even of his creator, and laments that he cannot have a family. He demands that Victor make him a companion, and Victor refuses because he doesn't want to repeat the heinous mistake he made in creating a life in the first place. The monster kills his best friend, framing him for the murder, then goes on to kill his wife the night after their marriage, after which Victor dedicates the rest of his life to pursuing his monster and destroying him. He progressed too far and meddled with powers man was not meant to, and now he must turn on his own progress and destroy it. He pursues the creature as far as he is able until his body gives out and he ends up on a boat in the Arctic. His last words are given to a captain, a warning. Quote, "In a fit of enthusiastic madness, I created a rational creature." And then on the next page, "Farewell, Walton. Seek happiness in tranquility and avoid ambition, even if it be only the apparent innocent one of distinguishing yourself in science and discoveries." The warning here against progress could not be clearer. Godwin advocated for education, against the state, and for the advancement of the progress of man. Whether he believed through his whole career that man could really progress to a state of immortality, his ideas about man's potential were grand. Victor is his daughter's response to the ideals. Whether conscious or not, it clearly paints a picture of a man who is enthusiastic in his pursuit of knowledge, a man who values education and discovers a love for science, then in his eagerness takes it too far and progresses beyond the point of return. His entire life is ruined by this one mistake, and he dies in regret, unable to even finish the monster off. This parallel isn't even one I was aware of until I began researching Shelley's life and reading about William Godwin's ideas, but to me, its potential is fascinating. Although it's true that we'll never actually know the truth of it, because these people lived in the 1800s.